You guys, I'm home. It is such an honor to be here. Thank you to the Macaulay Library, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology for having me here. This is my first time. I've long dreamed of coming to this place and have so much admiration for the work that all of you do. And it's just really an honor for me to share a little bit about what I'm doing with bird and all animal vocalizations that I can get my hands on to help spread the message of conservation and just the wonders that are contained in listening to the natural world, that experience, the science behind it, the stories we can tell in that acoustic medium. So without further ado, my name is Ben, aka Ecotone, DJ Ecotone. Yeah, mega nerd, I know. And I'm a professional wildlife DJ. What that means is that I travel the world recording animal sounds in different ecosystems, and then I sample those field recordings to create original music. All the samples we're going to hear today have no digital effects applied to change their, that's my phone, you can just turn that off. Actually text back, be like, this is really rude. I'm in the middle of something. So all the samples you're gonna hear today have no digital effects applied to change their pitch, their melody, and oftentimes even their natural rhythm is preserved. There's no auto-tune here. It's all 100% organic, natural sound, and that includes some rather peculiar but still organic sounds from me, which, if you'll give me a second, require a bit of a sound check. Here we go. Come on. Get down like me, never met a brother met fresh like boom. Never down like me, never met another man fresh like me. Wobbly wop, wop, wop. Sorry, you in the back. I'll pay for the medical bill. I apologize about that. All right, I think we're sounding good. Sounds okay out there? So thank you again to the Cornell Lab for trusting me with a microphone today. That's a big commitment. And I don't know if you knew what you were getting into, but now you do. But it's too late! So the origin of this combination of ideas has its roots in, well, my childhood. As Eric mentioned, I've been a birder since I was 3 and a beatboxer since I was 9. But until very recently, those two passions have pursued lives of their own. And I didn't really know how to combine them until I moved to New York City. I moved there originally to take a job in media and also to immerse myself in what has since become probably the best beatbox scene in the entire world. New York is incredible for its mouth musicians, and some of the female world champion, the last 2 Grand Beatbox Battle champions, these are various international events, all live in New York. It's really a powerhouse. So when I moved there 2 years ago to improve my skills, I found myself in very good company, but something else was missing. Surrounded by this concrete jungle for the first time, I grew up in suburbs with woods always nearby, I found myself cut off from the wilderness in a way I'd never experienced before. Even the birdsong outside my window was difficult to hear over the traffic. And so I set about trying to solve what was initially a personal problem by combining music, this thing that I was practicing in the evenings all the time that permeates even the most urban environment. I set about using that as a tool to reconnect with the natural world. And I started with local New York birds that I knew were out there, but were hard to hear. So I actually worked with the master set that I purchased from the Macaulay Library to kind of experiment, and those are some of the sounds you saw in that video there. It was just a chance for me to listen to natural bird songs and start to see what I could create by combining vocal acrobatics from the human and avian worlds. And you've just heard me perform the result of that. But let me explain a little bit about what just happened, because that's often a question people ask. It's like, what is going on? So I have here a couple of different pattern sequencers, loop stations, things like that. And if you'd like to come up later and see all the flashing buttons that make sounds, my life's pretty fun. I get to play with the toys all day. I get to have individual tracks like this. Oh, are you gonna hold it? Sweet. It's like The Price is Right. Just make sure you gesture. So these are individual scenes of music that I've composed, and if you go to note mode, I have built these individual, what are called racks of buttons with individual sounds on them. So you probably recognize some of these sounds. This is my crowd. I don't have to like.
What's that?
Yeah, quiz. Okay. So I've built multiple different drum racks, all with separate sounds. And I can move the cursor back and forth along these wave files until I hear a moment that jumps out at me. And when I choose to excerpt a moment, it's always sort of inspired by what I want to hear again. But sometimes it's one voice, sometimes it's a collection of voices. You can hear a twig snap, some wind blow, and then a bird sings. And that phrase represents a musical idea. Or it can be a single species just singing by itself. So there's a lot of flexibility here in terms of the things you decide to work with. But then I get to play these things as instruments. So they're pressure sensitive, so I'll turn that off so they're nice and loud for you. I can play woodpecker sounds and form a drum beat and then lay things over that. And the result, thank you for holding this, Eric, that's very helpful. The result gives us something like this. We'll build it up from the beginning. So that's me playing a. Good, yeah. Gotta make sure you're awake. So warning doves, cardinals, and a blue jay, the bell call. Blackbird, redwing. And then I add my beatboxing over it. And they can change it. And this is one of my favorites because it just shows off the blue jays' mimicry abilities. One of my favorites. Let's turn that on. So those are all different blue jay sounds, but if you weave them together, they create this amazing melodic idea. It's like you're taking natural music and breaking it down and transforming it into something new. And I'll get to more of that later. But that's the behind-the-scenes glimpse at the first song. Thank you, Eric, for holding that.
So what is that machine?
This is an Ableton Push. It's a live. You may have seen it when I did the opening number. There were times when I was beatboxing with the music, and other times when the beatboxing was already happening. That's because these technologies allow me to layer my voice. So I can migrate from one musical idea to the next, because I am, at the end of the day, just one person. And while beatboxing enables you to jump between lots of different things in one sort of vocal feat of these acrobatics, still, it's nice to be able to harmonize yourself, to layer things over each other, because then you can really build out the richness of each sound. Because inevitably, if you do a lot of this jumping back and forth, you don't get to invest as much energy in just polishing this one particular drum sound. For example, you'll have a much shorter. Like the snare itself is not as clean as if you were to do it by itself. So that's what looping allows you to accomplish, is kind of a cleaner overall product. So I set about making these pieces of music, and listening to all these bird songs through my headphones, I felt connected again. I had restored my feeling of connection to nature. But what I realized in the process was something really, really fascinating. In sound production, in the music studio and in nature, many of the rules are the same. In order to make itself heard, an individual instrument or an individual voice needs to carve out a special place in the mix. This isn't a shouting contest. And when they carve out that special place, it tells you something deeper about wildlife vocalizations that may sound like music to our ears, but really, they're language. And everyone in the room knows what I'm talking about. You're using these elements of naturally evolved language to tell a story of an evolving relationship between voice and landscape. And that narrative can be broken down into different interweaving elements of behavior and physiology, and of course, the changing natural environment. And as a musician, bringing these sounds back into an urban environment, I find myself becoming a translator for these orchestrated sonic ecosystems. Music, in turn, becomes our shared vehicle for connecting to and celebrating what's out there in the natural world. And we can then use it to propagate what's really incredible about these wild voices that we get to listen to and enjoy. As Eric mentioned, last fall I went on my first National Geographic expedition to the Western Ghats in southwest India. And our task was to record some of the endemic species that live in these shola forests, which have, over time, receded to just the mountaintops. They've become sky islands through a variety of factors. Climate change, and now anthropogenic climate change and human encroachment are causing those forests to shrink even more. So the endemic birds there are becoming critically endangered in many cases. But what's really fascinating is that the recession of these forests started millions of years ago, and the birds really don't like to leave those forests. So as they've become more isolated on these mountaintops, they've actually diverged into several different subspecies, sometimes just over a matter of a few kilometers, and each subspecies has its own song. So we set about going to each of these sites and recording the bird life that we could find there, and then ultimately we came away with some really interesting variations in natural sound. Now when we did these local concerts for people who lived in each town, their first question was, where can we find these birds? Our answer was, here, right here. This is where they are, and the only place where they live. And when they heard that, they got really inspired to try their own voices at creating this experimental mixture of singing from humans and wildlife. And I want to actually share with you a couple of the tracks that we made together on stage with various people in these towns. Just give me 1 second to cue it up. Now, these are people who've never tried this before, so it's a little rough around the edges sometimes, but I would oftentimes take them out to record birds. We'd bring them back to the lab, and then I would let them play the sounds as well. And sometimes I would teach them how to beatbox. It would be kind of whatever they felt most comfortable contributing to the overall track. So, let's see. And for context here, I gave them a drum track, so I'll just add some artificial drums, well, some drums as opposed to beatboxing into the mix to give you context and to reflect what they heard. So these are the bird songs we recorded in Bangalore, and students and I went on a bird walk to gather these sounds. And then they did something unexpected. So that's the first one. Pretty cool. And then we went, this one is from Cochin, which is a city much closer to the coast, much more humid. When I brought all this gear to Cochin, it was covered in moisture when I set up, and I was very nervous. Just envisioning the fire or just the explosion was about to happen. But this was a really nice surprise, and you'll see why in a second. So that's beatboxing. It's not me. Someone came on stage and already knew how to do it. So I lost my mind. So I laid down, admittedly with some vocal effects to kind of create more contrast. I sang a bass line. And then this happened. was back where I did an artist residency at the National Center for Biological Sciences, again in Bangalore. And we just finished the tour, so we were bringing some of the bird species that we recorded out there back to the starting point. So I laid down the beatboxing, and then asked them to play the bird songs. This one was particularly catchy. Sometimes just let it breathe. Give it space. And this happened. A lot of traditional Indian music is very similar to the beatboxing you heard me doing. They articulate what they want to play on instruments through vocalizations. The one that I'm most familiar with is Cornell, but this is a more urban tradition as far as I know. So combined. So I thought that was great. Round of applause for them. All of these traditional Indian rhythms and musical ideas, as well as the styles in which Indian people played the bird songs, were so different from the musical traditions I came from and the ideas that I incorporated into the music. And through that process, I discovered that we had created something really special. It was something that was ultimately represented an anthem to each place's natural heritage. It expressed how people from both sides of this immense, from both sides of the ocean related to nature in these places as artists, as scientists, and as human beings. And the song that we created together was a musical document of that relationship. And that was really cool. And so when we finished making these songs together and kind of sharing musical ideas, we went out into the field to look for the birds themselves. And many of the people in our audiences and our classes surprised us by knowing very little, as I mentioned before, about the birds in their backyards. They were astounded to realize that the things that were coming to their bird baths were not only really, really interesting vocal musicians, but also exceptionally rare species. So they felt an increased sense of kinship to their own natural heritage, but then they surprised us again, because when we went walking to find the birds, they started to recognize the sounds from riffs in the music. Suddenly, we had more than just a combination of two seemingly disparate passions. This was more than a collection of cool songs. We had a teaching tool for getting people to connect with and engage in the natural world, oftentimes right on their doorstep. It was really exciting, and I think we can all agree that when the time comes to take action for conservation, a lot of different angles are equally applicable, but it's very important to be able to celebrate what makes the natural world so amazing. Oftentimes we're inundated with these very sobering facts that, while they cannot be ignored, may seem hopeless and somewhat paralyzing when you think about it. And I think being able to celebrate what's out there is a great motivator to kind of get new audiences involved in this idea of connecting to nature. And it allows us to then take action with our own sense of responsibility for tuning in before the sounds themselves disappear. In this process of working with birdsong, I've been able to now make this series with National Geographic, and we'll be going to Madagascar. And birds are my gateway. It's what I've loved most of my life. But you can expand this same practice to other animal groups, other taxa, and this is where I am now, creatively, scientifically. I used to be a science journalist, and when I would write a story, I would often use the news to focus my attention as a musician, because sound is such an incredible landscape to choose different ideas from, that I would write songs made from the voices of animals in my articles. And that would be a way of kind of translating the news into a new storytelling medium. And now I'm able to kind of continue that, but beyond the bird world. And I want to say, before I share my next composition with you, that even if music isn't your gateway for appreciating the natural world, I hope this encourages you to uncover hidden dimensions of your own creativity and find confidence in combining different ideas that represent who you are as a conservationist, as a scientist, as a storyteller, because that's how we all really push this idea of natural history and wildlife conservation forward. I think that really makes us all feel much more connected. And I, for one, am now feeling connected with new groups of animals all over the world, including this one underwater. We're going to the Great Barrier Reef. Does anyone know what we're listening to right now? Snapping shrimp, yep. And the other sound, oh, how appropriate. Not planned. The other sound, the sharper clicks, are parrotfish chipping away at coral. And we actually worked with several different sounds from the Macaulay Library to create the basis for this composition for the National Geographic series. So many of these sounds come from right here. Humpback whales.
Sing. Come on. Sing. Sparkle. No splashing. Just sing. Just sing.
He asked you to sing. Sonoran Desert. This is a really powerful example of how one riff in an animal's vocalization can spark an idea for a whole song. I was listening to different animals recording in the Sonoran Desert and came across this track. That's just a bobcat vocalization on loop. This is what I hear. I just thought the track is going, and then this moment happens, and I'm like, I want to hear that again. Okay. I hear you, bobcat. Pretty fresh. Let's see what you got. Let me try something. I hear wake you up, like. And we got some mountain lion in the mix. Do you hear the coyotes? Giving things space, breathing room. There we go. Love that too, we've been to 3, and I guess 4 different ecosystems. And before I share my last piece about my upcoming trip to Madagascar, does anyone have any questions about what else is happening up here, or sounds you want to hear again that you were curious about? I'm happy to take some. Yes?
I have a question about how do you just know which sounds are going to be harmonious together? Or there's sounds that just don't work together that you have found in combination, or can you make anything work with the right layers?
It's a long creative process, especially since I don't manipulate any of the natural sounds. That's kind of my cardinal rule. I see what you did there. I make so many unintentional puns, I'm just becoming lamer by the second. It's really bad. It's a really good question, and it just takes a lot of experimentation and listening to these field recordings. Essentially, I will take one, like that bobcat at the beginning of the desert track, and say, okay, that's an idea I think I can work with. It gives me a rhythmic bass as well as kind of a melody to work with for a cool bass line. And then I'll keep that in my head as I listen to other field recordings and excerpt moments that start to work and fill in the gaps of a song that I can sort of hear in my head. But you also have to kind of surrender to the process, because you can't always predict how the wildlife is going to sound. And they're the driving force behind all of this. I can't say, okay, I want a bobcat to do this. I mean, try that in real life, no? Doesn't work. It's equally impossible in the studio, and you have to be willing to try things that don't work. And what you're hearing now is an ongoing creative experiment, really. In the National Geographic series, delivered a series of tracks from some of these ecosystems that were quote-unquote finished masters. But in my mind, none of this is finished. I mean, first of all, I want to keep going to these places and delving into the sounds more and more. You heard the New York birds in the video, and then again here. That's the same set of samples, revisited a year later. So you can return to the same sounds you think you know, dig deep, and find a whole new creative idea. There are a lot of different ways to approach it, but I think I'm able to kind of keep one anchor in my brain attached to a sample that I really like, that I'd like to preserve and have be the driving force, and then build things around that. And while I'm doing this, I have to really hope that an ambulance doesn't go by, or that my fridge doesn't start making noise. I unplug a lot of my appliances. It's sort of I live alone, so it's a good thing. Yes?
So this, I'm imagining a little game that one could play, especially a place like this. Do you ever do this on an improv basis? Somebody throws a bird song out at you, and you take it and run?
Removing the safety net, yeah. I have a fixed set of samples that I've kind of prepared, and I'll oftentimes work in production software like Isotope, which, for those of you who don't know, is fairly similar to Raven in some ways. You get to see the sonograms and map out what's happening, and that's really fun in its own right. But I can't just ask for any bird and then cue it up, because I've cleaned up the samples so that, because sometimes there's a lot of wind interference, and therein lies the artistic question as well as the scientific question of, do I want to remove information? And that's a tricky one, because I don't like taking information away from a track, but sometimes, to your question, to make things work, you need to add a filter to the lower end. So that's something where I ultimately compromise a little bit, because I just have to make the puzzle fit together. But what I do love to do is bring people on stage at the end of my shows, and if you guys have time, we can totally do this. I let them play the samples the way I did with my students in India, and then they will give me something, and I'll beatbox along with them, and that's the improvisatory part of it. Because that's just all here, and I have all my ideas up here, so it doesn't require anything to be queued up, but that's the improvisational element of the show. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, this has been the most fun since the Mingles played the Christmas party like 8 or 10 years ago. In the lab. And I'm wondering, like, I think this is the greatest thing I've ever heard, but I'm wondering how, like, in popular culture, if you're in Brooklyn, like, are we responding to this in such a positive way because we're nerds like you, or is the general public jazzed about this? Like, I want you to go on, like, America's Got Talent, and Women for Science.
right? Well, I thought it was just going to be nerds like us. I really did, but New York, as it turns out, everyone in that city, whether they know it or not, shares this need to reconnect with nature, because we just don't have it. And there are some people who've never experienced that connection. And so whether it's working with inner city kids or people who have moved to New York, and both of those demographics are very large, you can make people feel a whole new experience they've never had before, and that's intrinsically exciting, inherently exciting. Or you can make them feel the same emotional experience that I went through when I started to do this music. And that was something I did not plan for, could not have planned for, but people really respond to it. I do shows at museums, at the Bronx Zoo, at the New York Botanical Garden, and people come up and either they dance or they just sort of wonder what on earth is going on, and then when I get to tell them, this is this, and it lives in your backyard, they freak out. Because then they can go on these walks and tune into nature in a new way. And that's kind of the way that the process becomes bigger than me, and that's what I'm most grateful for, is it's not just me with my unique interests and skills combining into something. It becomes something that everybody shares. Yeah.
You do it in the subway platforms?
I don't have the right generator to do this on subway platforms. I do beatbox on subway platforms, because I have a mobile battery-powered amp.
I just imagine the acoustics down the tunnels, some of this.
Totally. Yeah, yeah. Yes?
So I'm pretty ignorant about this whole genre, but so you said you subway platforms and museums.
You know, two ends of the spectrum.
Right. I mean, you do clubs where people are not there because they care about nature, but you're just providing dance music.
Ah, but they will care about nature.
Right. My question is, are you able to build as just regular music?
I performed at the American Beatbox Championships. That's my primary family in just the musical world. I've been a musician for most of my life, guitar, vocals, but beatboxing has stuck with me the longest, and that community is really strong. And they're excited that I'm taking beatboxing to something that no one else has tried before. But then, yeah, you get to tell them, they're just expecting a set. They have no idea what it's going to be. So in those situations, you see the converts, and that's amazing, because they didn't know anything before, and all of a sudden they're listening to everything in a whole new way.
I think related to these two questions, Ben, you were telling me last night that you were playing the lemur piece that I think you're going to play us, and that it was just so cool that everybody was up dancing, you know, and totally getting into the musical part of it.
Yeah.
You know, in addition to whatever else cool nature stuff is going on.
Yeah, I mean, you see a variety of responses, and that also influences how, as you said, you don't know much about the genre. Neither do I. I'm making it up. And as I'm adding these elements and seeing the response from the audience, that informs me of how to steer my craft in a more constructive direction. Sometimes I have to check myself, because I'll play a chickadee song and nobody knows what it is. And that boggles my mind every time. But it makes me do a reset and realize this is new in every sense to these people who are listening right now. Let's take it back to basics and move forward again with something more complex, expand from birds into another group of taxa. But it's always about that give and take. That relationship is really what's a defining part of my work and this genre, as you may call it. It's half educational and half musical. And so my skills are always growing on each side. I feel like I have a constant mixture of things, and that's why it's so exciting to be in a place like here where there's so many disciplines under one roof. And you may even come from a very specialized niche, but as you start to work across disciplines, you realize that there are new things you can add to your arsenal. And that includes audience feedback in my case. Yes?
Have you ever played around with, it just strikes me as it's a fun way to try and visualize some abstract concepts relative to species diversity. So people respond to the sound when they think about species disappearing from a soundscape, or natural or anthropogenic sound masking sound in the landscape, that this might be a great vehicle for, or an interesting vehicle for playing with that idea where you could take a group of species where you've sampled and play in, you know, some nice loops, and then make a couple of these like remove them from the mix and see how the mix feels empty to the audience, or have a really cool mix of underwater whales, let's say, and then layer over ship traffic, or you know, roadside birds and layer over cars. And it seems like it'd be a great way to visualize it. And I wonder if you played around with those ideas at all, or sort of some very directed conservation topics that you might be able to like visualize through sound and beatbox. Like you might be able to do the traffic as beatbox for all I know,
Right.
or the boat traffic certainly.
Right.
So, you know, underwater weird sounds.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, right. The final piece I'll play has sort of more of this transitional element. You heard a bit of it in Desert, but moving back and forth between my orchestration and the natural orchestration of the sounds in an ecosystem. You move between soundscape and my music, I would love to work more with sounds like that, and I just haven't had a chance yet to. I think my next priority is to start going to these places in person, because for me the experience will be complete and the storytelling dimension will be complete and inform my presentation if I've gone there and recorded the animals myself. But I have experimented with. This next piece focuses mostly on lemurs, and when I first started working with lemurs, there was a story that came out about how a lot of lemurs were being trapped and sold in the illegal pet trade. And one of the immediate impacts from that was a drop-off in the diversity of flora on the island. In a lot of the rainforests, trees were having trouble reproducing because these lemurs distribute the seeds, and without them, the seedlings don't have anywhere to go except at the roots of their parent tree, and of course they can't compete with that tree. So I started to work with more experimental sounds for that, created a couple of songs that involved the sounds of like cage doors slamming shut, and kind of experimental techniques, and I want to get more into that. And I think that's how sound can really be a storytelling mechanism. And in terms of visualizing things, I think in the episodes, my series on Nat Geo is called Wild Beats. And they're just short 2-minute videos, really, music videos. But the visualization component involves a lot of clips of these animals vocalizing when their sound comes into the mix. So it not only helps people make that connection, but reinforces what's happening, and just having visual and sound together is, of course, more powerful. And I'm thinking already about how to move into sonograms as a dimension of that, because I think it's really powerful. You know, if you listen to music for sometimes 8 hours a day, like I do, your ears start to fool you, or you just listen to audio of any kind. But the sonogram is a great way of anchoring your perspective and your understanding of the data that you're working with. And if you look at a soundscape before and after, I'm sure many of you know that study that Bernie Krause did in the Pacific Northwest about selective logging, and he shows sonograms before and after that practice was exacted on the environment. And you see all these bird songs in the upper registers, the higher frequencies, just erased, gone from the mix. So this idea of voices fitting into their own separate puzzle pieces is suddenly undone, and it really reinforces the feeling of emptiness after we have influenced an environment. I'll take more questions in a little bit, but I wanted to share with you this one more piece. I have yet to find, I found one. Blue whales have an incredible bass that would work perfectly in this, but because they don't live on land in Madagascar, I have substituted a couple of vocalizations of my own with effects to achieve a deeper bass feeling. But all the drums you're going to hear are from my voice and actually from trees. Since I really am excited about these symbiotic relationships, I actually walked around Prospect Park, you know, with this microphone effect, hitting trees, flicking bark, and getting looked at like a weirdo. And I was like, what? Something weird? Something I did? Something I said? No? Okay, cool. Keep walking. But so all of these drum sounds are going to be a combination of beatboxing and tree drums, and then everything else is lemurs and birds. So without further ado, let us get to the lemurs. Okay. So I'm going to hang out for a little bit. If people want to come up and tap some buttons and make animal sounds, you're welcome to. Also, just come say hello. I'd love to chat more. But thank you very much for having me today. It's been a real honor.
Ben's around for the rest of the afternoon. He goes back to the city tonight. So if anybody wants to chat with him or tap buttons, there he is.
And if you want to hear more of my music, you can follow me on social media, DJ Ecotone. I have business cards here. Wild Beats is on Nat Geo Kids, and it's actually going on television tomorrow, which is blowing my mind. We made it for the internet. We made it for the internet, and for lack of an understanding of how TV works, some executive in a suit said, "Put this on television," and everyone did. So it's really exciting to be able to share this with more and more people, and I'm going to be creating more work on my own as well. So I hope you guys will tune in, and thanks again.